Shadows in the diner. The neon sign above Grace's Diner flickered faintly, casting a dull red glow over the gravel parking lot. A few weathered pickups and semis dotted the area, their drivers taking a break from the long, lonely highways. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint aroma of grease that never quite left. At the counter, an older man sat nursing a mug of black coffee. His face, lined with years of experience, was mostly hidden under a faded ball cap. He was quiet, his weathered hands steady as they wrapped around the mug. He seemed like just another weary traveler, a part of the background. In the corner booths, a pair of truck drivers exchanged lazy conversation, their voices low and inconsequential. A young waitress, her smile as worn as the stained apron tied around her waist, moved between tables. She greeted customers with polite cheerfulness, though her eyes carried the weight of someone used to long hours and little thanks. The atmosphere was unremarkable, the kind of place where most people came and went without incident. But tonight, trouble found its way inside. The Wolves of the Iron Cross, a gang notorious for running drugs and extortion rackets, had been making their presence felt in towns like these. Two of their members swaggered into the diner, their boots thudding heavily against the tiled floor. Their leather jackets were emblazoned with a crimson wolf emblem that marked them as part of the gang. The taller one, Razor, had tattoos snaking up his neck and a crowbar hooked to his belt. His partner, Chopper, was wiry with a buzz cut, his sharp grin carrying a sinister edge. The room seemed to shrink under their presence. Conversations hushed, the truck drivers turning their gazes downward. Even the young waitress faltered, her smile fading as she quickly moved toward the kitchen. Behind the counter, Grace, the stout, gray-haired owner of the diner, emerged from the back with a towel in her hands. Her sharp eyes darted to the bikers, then to the man at the counter. She knew trouble when she saw it, and her fingers twitched toward the emergency button hidden beneath the register. Razor leaned casually against the counter, his smile thin and sharp. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Real friendly, too. Shame if anything were to happen to it." Grace stiffened but said nothing, her jaw tightening. The man at the counter didn't move, didn't look up, but his gray eyes tracked the bikers through the reflection in the napkin holder. His shoulders remained relaxed, but there was a quiet tension in the way he held himself, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment. Chopper leaned in closer to Grace, his grin growing wider. "We're here to talk business," he said. "Monthly dues, let's call it. Covers all kinds of accidents. Fires, break-ins, bad luck. You know the drill." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands, now gripping the counter, trembled slightly, though her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "We don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Razor chuckled, his tattooed hand drumming on the handle of his crowbar. "Lady, trouble is what happens when you don't pay up." That's when the man at the counter spoke, his voice low and calm but carrying a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a knife. "The lady doesn't look interested." The room seemed to freeze. Razor's smile disappeared as his focus snapped to the older man. "Mind your own business, old-timer. This doesn't concern you." The man finally looked up, his gray eyes locking onto Razor's with a calm intensity that made the biker hesitate, if only for a second. "It does now," the man said evenly. He set his mug down and turned fully to face them. "You're making a mistake." Razor sneered, recovering quickly. "And who the hell are you supposed to be? Some kind of hero?" "Name's Luke," the man replied, standing slowly. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though sizing them up without a care for what they might do next. "And I'm giving you one chance to walk away." Chopper laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You hear that, Razor? The old man thinks he's Clint Eastwood or something." But Razor wasn't laughing. There was something in Luke's demeanor that unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand moving toward the crowbar at his belt. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Luke didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed almost bored. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, his tone still maddeningly calm. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Around the diner, the few customers who remained were either frozen in place or inching toward the exits, unwilling to be caught in whatever was about to happen. Grace's voice cut through the silence. "Please," she said, her eyes darting between Luke and the bikers. "Don't start anything. Just leave." Razor ignored her. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to back down. With a sneer, he pulled the crowbar from his belt and pointed it at Luke. "Let's see if you've got the spine to back up that big talk." Luke's gaze didn't waver. He took a step forward, his hands at his sides, showing no signs of fear. "Last chance," he said quietly. And then everything happened at once. Razor swung the crowbar, the metal slicing through the air with a sharp whistle. But Luke was faster. He sidestepped the blow with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a man his age, grabbing Razor's wrist and twisting it with precise force. The crowbar clattered to the floor, and Razor let out a pained grunt as Luke pushed him back against the counter. Chopper moved to intervene, reaching for a knife tucked into his boot. But Luke was already moving, his foot shooting out to knock the knife from Chopper's hand before he could even grip it. In the same motion, Luke delivered a sharp elbow to Chopper's chest, sending him stumbling backward into a booth. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, but by the end of it, Razor and Chopper were both on the floor, gasping for breath and clutching at their injuries. Luke stood over them, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady. "I told you," he said quietly. "You were making a mistake." Grace stared in stunned silence, her hands pressed to her mouth. The few remaining customers looked equally shocked, their eyes darting between Luke and the bikers on the floor. Razor, still clutching his wrist, glared up at Luke with a mix of rage and fear. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. Luke leaned down slightly, his gray eyes boring into Razor's. "Just a guy who doesn't like bullies." With that, he stepped back, turning to Grace. "You've got a phone back there?" he asked. She nodded mutely. "Call the sheriff," Luke said. "Tell him to send a couple of deputies. These two have some explaining to do." The wolves retreat. The air inside the diner was heavy with tension. Grace, still gripping the phone, stared at Luke with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Razor and Chopper, the once arrogant bikers who had swaggered in looking to intimidate, now lay on the floor nursing their bruises and battered pride. The sound of a truck pulling into the parking lot momentarily broke the silence, but inside, no one moved. "You heard me," Luke said calmly, turning his attention back to Grace. "Call the sheriff. Tell him to come pick these two up." Grace's fingers hovered over the buttons of the phone. "And what if they come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "These guys don't just let things go. They'll come back with more of their gang. They'll—" Luke's steady gaze softened slightly. "They won't," he said. "Not if they know what's good for them." Razor, still cradling his wrist, sneered through the pain. "You think this is over, old man? You think you can just walk away from this? The wolves don't forget." Luke stepped closer to Razor, his boots crunching against the scattered glass from an overturned sugar dispenser. He crouched down, his voice low and deliberate. "You tell your friends," he said, "that Grace's diner is off limits. You come back here, you mess with these people again, and I'll make sure every one of you regrets it. Understand?" For a moment, Razor's bravado faltered. There was something in Luke's eyes, a quiet, unshakable confidence that suggested he wasn't bluffing. Chopper, still wheezing from the blow to his chest, nodded hastily. "Yeah," he muttered. "Yeah, we get it." "Good," Luke said, standing up. He turned back to Grace. "Call the sheriff anyway. They've got a record. I'm sure of it. Let the law handle the rest." 15 minutes later, the wail of sirens echoed through the night as 2 patrol cars pulled into the diner's parking lot. Deputy Carl Simmons, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, stepped out first, his hand resting on the holster at his side. He surveyed the scene inside the diner through the glass doors before entering, his partner close behind. "Evening, Grace," Simmons said, his voice calm but wary. "You mind telling me what's going on here?" Grace, still visibly shaken, gestured toward Luke. "Ask him," she said. "He handled it." Simmons turned to Luke, his eyebrows raised. "Handled what, exactly?" Luke stepped forward, his demeanor as composed as ever. "These two came in looking to extort money from Grace," he explained, nodding toward Razor and Chopper. "They got aggressive. I persuaded them to stop." Simmons glanced down at the bikers, noting the crowbar still lying on the floor and the knife now tucked into an evidence bag. "Persuaded, huh?" he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "And who are you?" "Luke Ryder," Luke replied. "Just passing through." Simmons studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, Mr. Ryder, you might have saved Grace a lot of trouble tonight. But I still need to take their statements and yours. Standard procedure." Luke nodded. "Of course." As the deputies began questioning the bikers, Grace pulled Luke aside. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Luke shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Just be careful. People like them don't always play by the rules." By the time the deputies hauled Razor and Chopper out to their patrol cars, the diner had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The truck drivers, who had stayed silent during the commotion, began talking again, their voices carrying a mix of admiration and curiosity about the quiet man who had stood up to the bikers. Grace poured Luke another cup of coffee, her hand steadier now. "So, where are you headed?" she asked. Luke took a sip before answering. "Nowhere in particular," he said. "Just passing through, like I said." "Well, if you're looking for work, I'm sure I could use someone like you around here," Grace said, half joking. "These roads aren't as safe as they used to be." Luke smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, but even as he spoke, his gaze drifted to the window, where the darkness beyond seemed to hold a promise of more trouble to come. Miles away, in a dimly lit clubhouse on the outskirts of town, the wolves of the Iron Cross were gathered. The atmosphere was tense, the usual bravado dampened by the arrival of a bruised and humiliated Razor and Chopper. The gang's leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, listened silently as Razor recounted the night's events. He was old, Razor spat, still nursing his injured wrist. But he moved like he'd been doing this his whole life. Took us both down like it was nothing. The leader, known only as Wolf, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And you just let him?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What were we supposed to do?" Chopper cut in. "He had us before we could even get a swing in." Wolf's gaze hardened. "You made us look weak," he said. "Now we've got to show that's not how we operate." Razor hesitated. "What do you want us to do?" Wolf stood, towering over the others. "We're paying this Luke Ryder a visit," he said. "And this time, we're bringing the whole pack." Back at the diner, Luke felt the subtle shift in the air, the kind that came with years of experience and instincts honed in dangerous places. He glanced at Grace, who was clearing tables, and the waitress, who was refilling salt shakers. "You should lock the doors early tonight," he said casually. Grace looked up, surprised. "Why? You think they'll come back?" Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, well-worn badge. He placed it on the counter where Grace could see it. Her eyes widened as she read the words engraved on it, "Special Forces Veteran." "Let's just say I have a feeling," Luke said, "and I'd rather be ready." The wolves close in. The diner was quiet, but Luke Ryder knew better than to trust the stillness. Years in combat zones had taught him that calm often came before the storm. He sipped his coffee, his gray eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. Grace had taken his advice, and locked the doors early, though she still lingered behind the counter, wiping it down with unnecessary thoroughness. The young waitress, Lisa, had gone home, her nervous glances betraying her relief at leaving before dark. Outside, the gravel parking lot sat empty except for a few trucks. The neon sign above the diner flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows against the building's facade. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of an engine grew louder, then faded. Luke placed his mug down, the sound drawing his attention. "You think they'll come back?" Grace asked, her voice low. Luke leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but ready. "I don't think they're the kind to let things go," he replied. "But don't worry. If they do, we'll handle it." Grace gave a thin, uncertain smile. "We?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Luke's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You've got me here, don't you?" The sound of engines shattered the quiet, growing louder with each passing second. Grace froze, her eyes darting toward the window. Headlights swept across the diner's interior, then cut off abruptly as several motorcycles roared into the lot. The rumble of engines died, replaced by the crunch of boots on gravel. Luke stood, his movements calm and deliberate. "Stay behind the counter," he said softly, his voice steady but firm. "And if things go south, call Deputy Simmons." Grace hesitated, then nodded. She reached under the counter, her fingers brushing against the phone, ready to dial. The door rattled as someone tried the handle. When it didn't budge, a heavy fist pounded against the glass. "Open up, Grace," a voice called, rough and threatening. It was Razor. "We just want to have a little chat." Luke moved to the door, his expression neutral. He flicked the lock open and pushed the door just enough to step outside, pulling it closed behind him. The wolves of the Iron Cross stood in a loose semicircle around the entrance, their crimson wolf patches catching the faint glow of the neon sign. There were 6 of them now, Razor and Chopper among them. At the center stood their leader, Wolf, his scared face illuminated by the dim light. Well, Wolf said, his voice low and menacing. "You must be the old man my boys were talking about." Luke took a step forward, his stance casual but deliberate. "They didn't mention you were coming," he said. "What's the occasion?" Wolf chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I don't like cleaning up after my men," he said, "but when someone embarrasses them, I make it personal." Luke tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "If you're here for payback, I'd suggest rethinking your plan." Wolf's grin widened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Big words for someone outnumbered 6-1, he said. "But I'll give you credit. You've got guts." Luke shrugged. "Numbers don't mean much if you don't know what you're doing." The tension crackled like a live wire. Wolf's hand dropped to his belt, where a knife gleamed under the neon light. Around him, the other bikers shifted, their postures tense and aggressive. "Let's see what you've got, old man," Wolf growled. The first move came fast, but Luke was faster. Razor lunged, his crowbar swinging in a brutal arc. Luke sidestepped, grabbing Razor's wrist and twisting it with precision. The crowbar clattered to the ground, and Razor yelped in pain as Luke shoved him backward into another biker, knocking both to the ground. Chopper came next, his knife flashing as he slashed at Luke. But Luke was already moving, his hand shooting out to grab Chopper's wrist. With a sharp twist, the knife fell, and Luke delivered a quick elbow to Chopper's chest, sending him sprawling. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. But Wolf wasn't done. He stepped forward, his knife held low, his movements deliberate and predatory. Luke watched him carefully, his stance shifting slightly. "You're good," Wolf said, circling him. "But you're not untouchable." "Neither are you," Luke replied. Wolf lunged, the knife slicing through the air. Luke sidestepped, his hand grabbing Wolf's wrist and twisting it downward. Wolf growled, his strength matching Luke's in the struggle. For a moment, they were locked, the knife trembling between them. Then Luke shifted his weight, using Wolf's momentum against him, The knife dropped, and Luke swept Wolf's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Luke kicked the knife away and stepped back, his breathing steady. The other bikers froze, their leader incapacitated and their confidence shattered. Luke straightened, his gaze sweeping over them. "Take your boss and leave," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And don't come back." For a moment, no one moved. Then Razor scrambled to his feet, grabbing Wolf by the arm and pulling him up. The other bikers followed, their bravado replaced by fear and uncertainty. They retreated to their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they sped out of the parking lot. Luke watched them go, his posture relaxing slightly. He turned and stepped back inside the diner, where Grace stood frozen behind the counter. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke nodded. "For now," he said, "but you might want to keep that emergency number handy, just in case." Grace exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. "What about you?" she asked. "Are you okay?" Luke smiled faintly. "I've had worse," he said, "but I'll stick around for a bit, just to make sure they don't try anything else." As Grace began to clean up, Luke returned to his seat at the counter, picking up his coffee as if nothing had happened. Outside, the neon sign continued to flicker, its dull red glow casting shadows that stretched into the night. A battle of shadows. The aftermath of the wolves' retreat left Grace's diner in an uneasy quiet. Luke Ryder sat at the counter, sipping his now-cold coffee. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the ever-vigilant mind of a man accustomed to danger. Grace hovered near the kitchen door, glancing nervously at the windows every few minutes, as if expecting the gang to return. "Luke," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you think they're really gone?" Luke set his mug down with deliberate care. "For now," he replied. "But men like that don't let things go easily. Wolf's pride is hurt. That makes him dangerous." A battle of shadows. The aftermath of the wolves' retreat left Grace's diner in an uneasy quiet. Luke Ryder sat at the counter, sipping his now-cold coffee. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the ever-vigilant mind of a man accustomed to danger. Grace hovered near the kitchen door, glancing nervously at the windows every few minutes as if expecting the gang to return. "Luke," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you think they're really gone?" Luke set his mug down with deliberate care. "For now," he replied. "But men like that don't let things go easily. Wolf's pride is hurt. That makes him dangerous." Grace swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "What do we do if they come back? I can't afford to lose this place. It's all I have." Luke looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "You won't lose it. Not while I'm here." Grace nodded, her worry evident despite his reassurance. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Luke alone with his thoughts. He knew the wolves weren't finished. They had tasted defeat, and that would only stoke their anger. The only question was how far they'd go to reclaim their reputation. Meanwhile, at the Wolves' clubhouse on the outskirts of town, the gang gathered to nurse their wounds and plot their revenge. Wolf sat at the head of a battered wooden table, a bag of ice pressed against his jaw. The other members sat in tense silence, waiting for their leader to speak. Razor broke the silence first. "We can't let this go, boss. That old man humiliated us in front of everyone. If word gets out..." Wolf silenced him with a glare. "Word's already out," he growled. "And that's why we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." "What's the plan?" Chopper asked, his voice tinged with unease. Wolf slammed his fist on the table, making the others jump. "The plan is simple. We don't just take out the old man. We make an example of him. And anyone else who stands in our way." Razor and Chopper exchanged uneasy glances, but neither dared to question Wolf's authority. The gang leader leaned back in his chair, his scared face twisted into a sinister grin. "We hit the diner tonight," he said, "and we burn it to the ground." Back at the diner, Luke was preparing for what he knew was inevitable. He moved through the space methodically, checking the locks on the doors and windows, and making mental notes of potential vulnerabilities. Grace watched him from a distance, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. "What are you doing?" she asked finally. "Getting ready," Luke said without looking up. "They'll be back, and when they are, we need to be prepared." Grace frowned. "Prepared for what?" "A fight." "Luke, this isn't a war zone. It's just a diner." Luke paused, turning to face her. "You're right," he said. "It's just a diner. But it's your diner. And that means it's worth fighting for." Grace blinked, taken aback by the conviction in his voice. Before she could respond, the sound of engines in the distance sent a chill down her spine. Luke straightened, his expression hardening. "They're here," he said. The roar of motorcycles grew louder, filling the night air with an ominous rumble. Grace instinctively backed away from the windows, her hands trembling. Luke moved to the door, his movements calm and deliberate. He flipped the lock, then turned to Grace. "Stay in the kitchen," he said firmly. "Don't come out unless I tell you it's safe." Grace hesitated, then nodded. She disappeared into the back, leaving Luke alone to face the storm. The wolves arrived in force, their bikes forming a semicircle around the diner. Wolf dismounted first, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the entrance. The other gang members followed, their faces a mix of anger and anticipation. "Ryder," Wolf bellowed, his voice cutting through the night. "Come on out. Let's settle this like men." Luke opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the dim light from inside the diner. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I thought we already settled this," he said evenly. Wolf smirked, his hand resting on the hilt of a large hunting knife at his belt. "You think you've won because you got the drop on us once. Tonight's different. Tonight, we finish this." Luke's gaze swept over the group, noting their weapons and body language. He knew they weren't bluffing. But he also knew that fear and anger made men reckless. "Walk away," he said, his voice calm but firm. "No one has to get hurt." Wolf laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You're funny, old man. I'll give you that. But you don't scare me." Luke stepped down from the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I'm trying to save you from making a mistake you can't take back." Wolf's smirk faltered for a moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He drew his knife, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. "Let's see what you've got," he growled. The other bikers closed in, their weapons at the ready. Luke took a deep breath, his mind focused and clear. He had faced worse odds before. He could handle this. The first attack came from Razor, his crowbar swinging in a wide arc. Luke dodged effortlessly, grabbing Razor's wrist and twisting it until the crowbar fell to the ground. He delivered a sharp elbow to Razor's stomach, sending him crumpling to the gravel. Chopper came next, his knife slashing toward Luke's side. But Luke sidestepped and used Chopper's momentum against him, throwing him off balance and disarming him in one fluid motion. One by one, the bikers fell, their arrogance no match for Luke's skill and precision. Even Wolf, with all his bravado, couldn't land a hit. Luke moved like a shadow, always one step ahead, his every action deliberate and efficient. When the dust settled, the wolves lay scattered on the ground, groaning in pain. Wolf struggled to his feet, his knife still clutched in his hand. He glared at Luke, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. "Stay down," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made even Wolf hesitate. For a moment, it seemed like Wolf might listen, but then he lunged, his knife aimed at Luke's chest. Luke caught his wrist mid-strike, twisting it until the knife fell. He shoved Wolf backward, sending him sprawling into the gravel. "This is over," Luke said, his tone final. "You come back here again, and I won't be so forgiving." Wolf glared at him, but the fight had gone out of him. He motioned for the others to get up, and they began retreating to their bikes, their defeat unmistakable. As the wolves roared away into the night, Grace emerged from the kitchen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it over?" she asked. Luke nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "For now," he said, "but they won't forget this. Neither should you." Grace looked at him, her gratitude clear. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Luke gave her a faint smile, just doing what needed to be done. He turned back to the counter, his coffee waiting for him. The night was quiet once more, but both he and Grace knew it was a fragile peace, one that would need to be defended again if the time came. The calm before the storm. The wolves of the Iron Cross retreated, their roaring motorcycles fading into the distance. The silence they left behind felt unnaturally heavy, a quiet charged with tension and unfinished business. Inside Grace's diner, Luke Ryder stood by the counter, his steady hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. His face remained calm, but his mind worked rapidly, assessing the events of the night and preparing for what was to come. Grace emerged from the kitchen, her hands still trembling slightly as she clutched a dish rag. She glanced nervously at the locked door, and then at Luke, who seemed unshaken despite the chaos. "Do you really think they're gone for good?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke shook his head. "No, men like that don't let things go. Tonight was about pride, and they lost. That means they'll come back harder, more desperate." Grace swallowed hard, her fear evident. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Luke. I'm just trying to run a diner I didn't sign up for." She gestured vaguely toward the window, where the faint red glow of the neon sign flickered against the darkness. "For this." Luke's gaze softened as he set his mug down. "I know," he said, "but you're not alone. We'll get through this." Grace gave a weak smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She returned to wiping down the counter, her hands moving more out of habit than necessity. Miles away, the wolves regrouped at their clubhouse, the atmosphere thick with anger and frustration. Wolf paced back and forth, his scared face a mask of fury. The other bikers sat in tense silence, their heads bowed as they avoided his gaze. Twice, Wolf growled, his voice low and dangerous. "That old man made fools of us twice." Razor, nursing a bruised wrist, hesitated before speaking. "He's not just some old man, boss. He moves like he's trained. Military, maybe." Wolf's eyes narrowed. "I don't care if he's the damn president. Nobody disrespects the wolves and gets away with it." Chopper shifted uneasily in his seat. "What do we do now? Go back with more guys?" Wolf slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "No," he snapped. "This isn't about numbers anymore. This is about sending a message. We're not just taking him down. We're taking everything he's protecting." The room fell silent as the implications of Wolf's words sank in. The gang leader leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We're burning that diner to the ground." Back at the diner, Luke was busy making preparations. He'd already done a perimeter check, noting the vulnerabilities around the building. The back door's lock was weak, and the windows were large enough for someone to break through easily. He didn't share these observations with Grace. She was already nervous enough. Instead, he focused on reinforcing what he could. Using some wooden planks he'd found in the storeroom, he began fortifying the back door. Grace watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked, her voice tentative. Luke paused, hammer in hand. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Something like this," he said. Grace tilted her head, her curiosity overcoming her fear for a moment. "Who are you, Luke? Really?" Luke's smile faded as he turned back to his work. "Just someone who's seen enough trouble to recognize it when it's coming," he said. Before Grace could press further, the sound of tires crunching against gravel reached their ears. She froze, her eyes widening as she looked toward the window. "Is it them?" she whispered. Luke set the hammer down and moved toward the front of the diner. He peered out through the blinds, his posture tense but controlled. A single car had pulled into the lot, its headlights off. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. It wasn't one of the wolves. It was Deputy Carl Simmons. Luke unlocked the door and stepped outside to meet him. Simmons approached, his hands resting on his duty belt, his expression cautious. "Evening, Luke," he said. "Grace called me earlier, said there was some trouble." "There was," Luke replied, "but it's under control for now." Simmons raised an eyebrow. "For now?" Luke nodded. "They'll be back. And when they come, it won't just be for intimidation. They're planning something bigger." Simmons's jaw tightened. "You have proof?" "Just a hunch," Luke said, "but it's a strong one." Simmons studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll park down the road and keep an eye on things. If they show up again, I'll be ready." "Appreciate it," Luke said. Simmons gave a curt nod and returned to his car. As the deputy drove off, Luke re-entered the diner, his expression thoughtful. "Is he going to help?" Grace asked. "He'll do what he can," Luke said, "but when it comes down to it, we'll have to handle this ourselves." The night dragged on, the hours ticking by with agonizing slowness. Grace dozed fitfully in the back office, while Luke kept watch from the front. His instincts told him the wolves wouldn't wait long. They were impulsive, driven by ego and anger. Shortly after midnight, his instincts proved correct. The distant rumble of motorcycles broke the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Luke stood, his hand brushing against the pistol holstered at his hip. He glanced toward the office, where Grace was still asleep. "Stay there," he murmured under his breath, though she couldn't hear him. The wolves arrived in force, their bikes forming a menacing line in front of the diner. Wolf dismounted first, his scared face illuminated by the flickering neon light. This time, they weren't just armed with knives and crowbars. Several of them carried gasoline canisters, the intent clear. Luke stepped outside, his presence alone enough to make some of the bikers hesitate. But Wolf was undeterred. He strode forward, his posture oozing confidence. "Last chance, old man," Wolf said. "Walk away, or we'll make sure there's nothing left of this place by sunrise." Luke didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the group, noting their weapons, their stances, and their weak points. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." Wolf laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You really think you can stop us?" Luke's hand hovered near his hip, his fingers brushing against the grip of his pistol. "I know I can." The air crackled with tension, both sides waiting. The final reckoning. The tension outside Grace's diner was palpable, the quiet hum of the night replaced by the low growl of motorcycles and the heavy presence of danger. Luke Ryder stood on the diner's porch, calm and unyielding, his eyes locked on Wolf, the gang leader whose arrogance now teetered on desperation. Behind Luke, the faint light from the diner's interior cast his shadow onto the gravel parking lot, a silhouette that seemed larger than life. Wolf's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second as he watched Luke, but pride pushed him forward. Behind him, the other wolves fidgeted, their hands gripping weapons and gasoline canisters. The air smelled faintly of fuel, a reminder of the destruction they intended to leave in their wake. "I'll say it again," Luke began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "Walk away. You're not winning this fight. And you know it." Wolf spat on the ground, his smirk returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you tonight." "Neither will stupidity," Luke replied coolly. Wolf's grin twisted into a snarl. He raised a hand, signaling his men. "Burn it down," he ordered. The wolves surged forward, their canisters sloshing with fuel as they moved to encircle the diner. Luke's hand moved to his hip, where his pistol rested, but he held off for now. He knew there was a fine line between defending the diner and escalating the situation into something far deadlier. Before the bikers could reach the diner's walls, a blinding spotlight cut through the night, bathing the parking lot in harsh white light. The roar of an approaching engine followed, and moments later, Deputy Carl Simmons's patrol car skidded into the lot, its siren blaring. "Freeze!" Simmons shouted, stepping out of his vehicle with his gun drawn. The wolves hesitated, their momentum broken as they glanced at each other, unsure of their next move. "Cops," Razor muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I thought this was supposed to be a clean hit." Wolf glared at Simmons, then at Luke, realizing too late that he had underestimated the older man. "You called the law," he growled. Luke didn't answer, his steady gaze enough to confirm the accusation. "Drop the canisters and weapons," Simmons commanded, his voice firm. "Now." The wolves hesitated, their bravado faltering under the combined pressure of Simmons's authority and Luke's unwavering presence. One by one, they dropped their weapons and fuel canisters to the ground, their defiance giving way to fear. Wolf, however, wasn't ready to give up. He took a step toward Simmons, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can stop us?" he snarled. "You're just one cop." "He's not alone," Luke said, stepping forward. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Wolf pause. "You've lost, Wolf. Let it go." Wolf's eyes darted between Luke and Simmons, his mind racing. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh and raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, old man. You win this round." Simmons moved quickly, ordering the gang members to line up against the patrol car while he called for backup. As the other bikers complied, Wolf turned to Luke one last time, his expression dark. "This isn't over," he said. "You'll see." Luke didn't respond. He simply watched as the gang leader was cuffed and loaded into the back of the patrol car, his threats ringing hollow in the night air. With the wolves taken into custody, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Grace emerged cautiously from the diner, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke nodded. "For now." Simmons approached, his demeanor professional but friendly. "You all right, Grace?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands still shook. "Thanks to Luke," she said. "I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been here." Simmons glanced at Luke, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You've got some moves," he said. "Military." Luke gave a faint smile. "Something like that." Simmons nodded, seeming to understand. "Well, whatever your background, you did good tonight. We'll take it from here." The next morning, the diner was quiet, the events of the previous night leaving an uneasy stillness in their wake. Grace poured Luke a fresh cup of coffee, her movements more relaxed now that the immediate threat had passed. "You staying in town?" she asked, her tone hopeful. Luke shook his head. "I think it's time for me to move on," he said. "You've got Simmons and the law on your side now. You'll be fine." Grace frowned, but nodded. "Well, if you ever find yourself back this way, there's always a cup of coffee waiting for you." Luke smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As he stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting warm light over the gravel lot. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, the rumble breaking the morning silence. With one last glance at the diner, he pulled onto the road and drove away, leaving behind a town that would never forget the night Luke Ryder stood against the wolves of the Iron Cross. Back at the diner, Grace watched him go, a sense of gratitude swelling in her chest. She turned to clean the counter, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, knowing that even in the face of danger, there were still people willing to stand up for what was right.